Hey there guys, welcome to the Code Lab channel. In this video we'll be learning about one of the most important features in JavaScript, and that is the DOM. Now I'm going to split this tutorial up into two videos. The first video will be learning about all the aspects and features of the DOM, and in the second video we're going to be using everything we learned in this video and applying it to practical examples ranging from beginner to master level. So just before we begin, we're just going to take a look at a few prerequisites. So this two-part tutorial is primarily for beginners. So if you've never heard about the DOM, or maybe you're a little familiar with it but don't know how to utilize and apply it, this tutorial is for you. Now, in order to effectively understand the DOM and how it relates to working with the web, it's necessary to have an existing knowledge of HTML and CSS, and I have crash courses on both of those if you want to check those out before you start this tutorial. It's also super beneficial to have a familiarity with fundamental JavaScript, so the syntax and the code structure. If you guys want to learn about fundamentals of JavaScript, check out my JavaScript crash course, which covers the fundamentals. So there's a couple of things you'll need if you want to follow along this tutorial. You're going to need a web browser and a code editor. Now these are all the options you can use, and you can mix up these options if you like, but in this tutorial I'm just going to be using Chrome and Visual Studio Code, but again you guys can choose any combination you like. Now the structure of this tutorial, we're first going to take a look at what the DOM is. Then we're going to take a look at methods to select elements in the DOM, how we can traverse the DOM, how we can manipulate the DOM, and then finally we're going to take a look at event handling. So we'll start this off by explaining what the DOM is. So the DOM stands for Document Object Model. Now the document object is a built-in object that has many properties and methods that we can use to manipulate the content, the structure and the style of a project. And this ability to manipulate the DOM, or the document object model, is one of the most unique and useful abilities in JavaScript. So almost any time a website performs an action such as toggling a navigation menu or rotating between slideshow of images or even displaying an error, when a user attempts to submit an incomplete form, this is the result of JavaScript accessing and manipulating the DOM. Now another way of thinking about the DOM and understanding how it works is thinking of it as a tree of nodes, like you can see it on the screen now. So this is just a basic diagram of a DOM tree and all of its nodes. Now everything in this diagram is a type of node. The elements, the attributes, the text content, and even line breaks and comments, which we'll see a bit later on, are even considered nodes, and all of these make up the DOM tree. Now the DOM object itself is actually a property of the window object, which is the global top level object representing a tab in the browser, and this window object has access to such information as toolbars, the height and width of the window, prompts and even alerts. But in this tutorial we're only interested in the document object, which is what is inside of the inner window and the stuff we want to manipulate. Now another important thing to note here is that most of these nodes in this diagram have a parent-child sibling relationship. The topmost node, i.e. the document node here, is the root node of the DOM tree, which we use to access the DOM and manipulate all of the content. Now this document node has one child node, which is the HTML element, and the HTML element is a parent node to the head and the body elements. Now the head and body elements are what you would call siblings, since they're on the same level in the DOM tree. Underneath the head element you see it has one child node, which is the title element, and the text, "This is my website," is a child node of the title element, and these relationships are similar over the other side, where the body element is the parent to the paragraph and the h1. The paragraph and the h1 are siblings to each other, and the text content inside each of these elements are child nodes to the paragraph and h1. So the my link and my header are child nodes to the h1 and the paragraph element. Now we can also see by the paragraph tag we have a class attribute. Now HTML attributes such as IDs, or classes in this case, styles, etc. are also considered as nodes in the DOM hierarchy, but they don't actually participate in this parent-child sibling relationship like the other nodes do. The way they are accessed is through properties of the element node that they're contained in. Now often there will be times you want to move throughout the DOM, so understanding this parent-child sibling relationship is crucial to understanding how JavaScript works with HTML. Alright guys, so now we know a little bit more about what the DOM is and learn about the DOM tree. The next thing to cover in the tutorial is how to select these nodes or elements in the DOM tree for manipulation. So before we take a look at all these methods of selecting elements, let's just quickly go over the layout you see here in the browser. So in the index.html file, we've got a div with a class of container. Inside of that we've got a heading which has the ID of main heading, and then the text of favorite movie franchise. Underneath that we have a UL tag which has 5 list items inside of it, and then each of these list items have a class of list items, so super creative. Now this is what we're going to be working on when we're looking at selecting, styling, traversing and manipulating for the rest of this tutorial. And then underneath that we have a script tag which has the attribute of source, and this is just linked to the app.js file. So again guys, in order to be able to manipulate an element in the DOM tree, we first have to select that particular element. Now luckily for us there's several ways we can do this, and the 5 major ways of selecting the elements are the ones you see on the screen now. So we've got get element by ID, get element by class name, tag name, query selector, and query selector all. Now some of these methods are pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to go over each of them one by one now. So the first one we're going to go over is getElementById. And as you probably guess, you can select an element using this method by its unique ID. And this is the easiest way to find a HTML element inside the DOM tree, because as we know from CSS, the ID attribute is used for something unique. Now if we remember back to the HTML file, you can see that we've got the H1 here, which you see in the browser, has the ID of main heading. So this is the element we're going to be selecting. So first we need to select the document object model, which is just simply document. Then get the method of getElementById, single quote marks, really important that you include those. And then we're just going to grab the ID, which is main heading. Close that off. Now what we can do with this selection is actually place it inside a variable so we can manipulate it. So we're going to go at the front here and just say const, we'll say title, and we'll set this to the ID of main heading. And if we log this into the console now, so we'll just log in title, you see it shows up on the console now, and if I hover over this you can see it highlights in the browser there, so you know now we've selected this element. And then what we can do from here is now select that variable we just created for the element, and we can add styles to the element, manipulate its attributes, traverse the element, so all of that good stuff, which we'll be looking at in just a moment. Now next we have the getElementByClassName. Again, quite self-explanatory. This method returns a collection of all the elements in the document with that specified class name. So for example, in our HTML file here, you can see all of our list items have that really creative class name of list items. So we can select all of these using the getElementByClassName method. So we'll do the same thing, we'll put it inside a variable, we'll just say list item, and we'll set it to the document, we'll say getElementByClassName, put single quote marks in there, and then we'll just say list items, I think it's items, yeah it's items, and then we'll just log this in the console so we know we've selected that element or these elements. And as you can see, using the method of getElementsByClassName, we've now selected all of those elements. Now this method actually returns an array-like object of all the child elements, which have all the given class names. So if we open this up, you can see it's indexed, and they're in the order that they are in the HTML file. Now the next method here, which is getElementByTagName, is pretty similar to the getElementByClassName, in that it accepts a tag name and returns all of the elements of that specified tag name in the order in which they appear in the document. So again, returning an array-like object for all the child elements with the given tag name. So for this example, all I'm going to do is just copy and paste the class name example, comment this out, and then we'll just say tag name. And because the list items are list items, we just type in li. And if we take a look at the console now, you can see it's got that HTML collection of all the 5 list items, and they're all indexed in the order that they appear in the HTML file. So you can see this method is pretty similar to the getElementByClassName method. Now the query selector method that you see here is used to select one item or the first item that matches the selector it's given. So if you have multiple items with the same class name or the same ID or even the same tag, it will select the first one it comes across. So the beauty of this method, as you probably just guessed, is that it can accept all CSS style selectors, again allowing it to select it by its tag or its class or even its ID. So we can actually use this method to actually grab any element in our HTML file here. So what I'm going to do is use it to grab the div of the class of container, which is acting as a container for the rest of the content. So we'll just go underneath here and we'll create a variable, and we'll keep it super creative and call it container, and we'll grab the document and then grab the query selector method. And again, with this method we can grab the div tag, or we can grab the class name, or if it had an ID attribute we can grab that instead. What I'm going to do is grab the div tag and then just log this into the console so we know it's working. And as you can see in the console now, using the query selector method, we've selected that div with the class of container. Now, as I just mentioned, when we're using the query selector, it selects the first item that matches the selector it's given, which in this case is the div. Now, if we go into the index.html file and we use several more divs, again, it's only going to select this first div here. If we had more divs in this example and we were to select them all, we then use the query selector all instead. So what I'm going to do actually is just duplicate this one more time, just zoom out a little bit, and then just going to change a bit of the word in here. So favorite sports, and I'm not going to bother changing the names here, but just to show you guys that it selects all of them, I'm just going to copy and paste this, but instead of query selector, we're going to say query selector all, and then comment this out, and quickly just comment all these out so we can only see that variable there. And if you take a look at the console now, you can see that this method returns a node list of collections of all the matching elements that matches that specific CSS selector, which in this case is a div. So similar to the get by tag name and get by class name, where we get a HTML collection, in this method we get a node list, and as you can see, it selected both of the containers, because unlike the query selector, with query selector all, it's selecting all of the divs in the index.html file. So that's how we can select elements with the query selector and the query selector all method. So to quickly summarize this section, when you need to select a DOM element, you have 5 different options to choose from, 5 different ways of essentially doing the same thing, which is selecting an element or elements. Personally, I primarily use query selector and query selector all because these methods select elements through CSS selection, and I primarily use this to select IDs and classes, mainly because these CSS selectors provide a really powerful and efficient way of selecting HTML documents, especially IDs, because you likely understand that elements shouldn't have the same ID, that the ID is a unique identifier of that element within the document. So with that in mind, selecting an element with its ID is a safe bet because you wouldn't go and apply manipulation to different elements unless perhaps that's what you want to achieve. In that case, the query selector all method and the class selector is what I typically use. So now we know all the different methods that we can use to select an element in the DOM tree. We can finally start doing some manipulating now. So firstly, what I'm going to do is just get rid of all of this content here, and then head in the index.html file and just get rid of the second container because we don't really need it. So let's start things off by taking a look at how we can change the styling of an element. So if you are familiar with CSS and CSS properties, we have a way we can access these properties in JavaScript. So the first thing we'll do is just select this main heading, which we have in our index.html file here, which is just the title of the container. So we're going to put that in a variable, and we'll call this variable title, and then document.query selector method, and we'll grab the ID of this element, which is main heading. Oh, need to put these in single quote marks, and then let's just log this in the console so we know this variable is working. And as you can see, now we've selected this element and stored it inside the variable of title. So what we can do now is actually manipulate the styling of this element and change it around using CSS properties. So to access CSS properties in JavaScript, we'll just first grab the variable we want to apply the styling to, which in this case is the title or the main heading, and then we simply type in the style property. And then after this style property, you just use any CSS property you want to apply to this element. So what we'll do is just change the color of the text, and we'll set this to let's say red. And as you can see in the browser now, we've changed the color of the main heading from white to red using the style property and then the CSS property of color. Now this type of styling is what you'd call inline styling, and there are other methods to style elements with JavaScript, but this is probably the most direct method. Now again, if you take a look in the console, you could see it's actually included the style attribute, again because this is actually done through inline styling. Now it's important to know this because with inline styling, this actually only works on a single element. If I tried, let's say, applying it to all of the list items here, this wouldn't actually work. So just going to demonstrate that to you guys. So let's create another variable, and we'll call it list items, and we'll grab all of those list items with query selector all. They all have a class of list items. And then let's just log in here list items. So you see now in the console we've selected all of those list items. Now let's try and use the style property again on these list items and see if it works. So we'll say style, let's try and change the color again, or let's actually do the font size. And just quickly guys, I wanted to mention that it's important to remember while using the style property, CSS properties are written in camel case and not with a more standard snake case, which has the dash. So the camel case is essentially just a capital letter to begin the second word and any subsequent word in the name or method or even a property. The font size in CSS would be written like this, but in JavaScript we'll use camel case. So just so you guys are aware of that. Now again, back to what we were talking about. If I try changing all of the font size of these list items here, so let's say to about 2 rem, you can see this isn't actually working because it's trying to apply an inline style to 5 different list items, which wouldn't work. If we actually wanted to apply this styling to all of the list items, we need to loop through the list items first. So just to show you guys how that would work, we'll say I equals 0, and then we'll say I is less than the list items dot length, which just gives us the amount of list items inside of our UL here, which is 5, and then we want to say we want this to increment by 1 each time. And then what we do now is just apply this and put it inside of our for loop, and then we just need to index the I. And as you can see now, it was quite subtle, so let's just make it a bit bigger. You can see all of the list items now have that styling because it's been looped through using the for loop. So that's how we can apply inline styling to elements using the style property, or multiple elements if we loop through them. And the next thing I want to take a look at is creating elements. So what I'm going to do is just comment all of this out first. Get rid of the list items there. I'm just going to put a comment here for styling elements, and then now we'll do one for creating elements. So again, another really cool thing about DOM manipulation is that we can create elements from our JavaScript file here, and we do that with a simple method really of create element. So let's say we wanted to add another list item here in our favorite movie franchise container. What we need to do first is just create a variable for the unordered list, because we need to enter this unordered list. So we'll say document dot query selector, grab the UL, and then what we'll do now is use the create elements method to create another list item. So we'll just use another variable here. So document dot create element, and we'll create a list item. Now this isn't actually going to do anything at the moment. This element we've just created in this variable here needs to be inserted into our document, and the way we can add elements inside of the document is using the append method. So what we'll do is first grab the UL because we want to append this list item inside of this UL, and then we grab the append method and the element we want to append, which is the variable of li, which again is just this list item. Now you won't be able to see it currently at the moment, but if we take a look at the document here, and if we open this up and then open up the div of the class of container, open up the UL, you can see there's an extra list item inside of this UL now, because we've inserted this element now using the append method. Now what we can do from here is add some content inside of our list item. So I'm just going to bring this back down, go back in the console, and I'm just going to put a comment here for adding elements. And then after this we're just going to say modifying the text. Now we don't really need this console log anymore. So there are several ways we can include text or modify text in our HTML, and those ways are inner text, text content, and inner HTML. Now there is a difference between the three, so to demonstrate those differences I'm just going to put another HTML tag inside of the first list item here. So I'm just going to put a span, I'm going to put neo because that's relevant to the matrix, and then I'm just going to create another variable to grab that element there. So we're going to say first list item, set that to the document, and we'll say query selector, and then we'll grab that list item, and then I'm just going to grab the console log again actually and put in here first list item. Oh, forgot an S. So there's our first list item. Now what I'm going to do here is include inner text first, so it just displays the text. Duplicate this a couple more times, and I'm going to grab text content, and then also grab inner HTML. So if I just pull this up a bit more now, if you take a look at the console you can clearly see the differences between the three now. and that is essentially just the way they're displayed. So with inner text here, you can see we're simply getting the visible text contained inside that node. With text content, you see it's actually being displayed the same way it is in the HTML file. So it's got all those indents, and it's jumping onto a new line. And with inner HTML, a similar sort of thing with the indents and jumping on new lines, but it's also showing the tags, so showing us the span tags inside of our HTML here. So again, that's pretty much the differences between the three. Now another thing here is that with inner HTML, there is a bit of a danger using inner HTML, and that's mainly its security issues. You don't really want user input to be displayed in the inner HTML, because this actually allows the user to control the JavaScript and the HTML on your web page, which obviously has its problems there. So in most cases, you're just going to use inner text. So let's go ahead and use that and implement that in our list item that we created. So we're just going to grab the li, grab inner text, and we're going to set this to equal, let's say, X-Men, which is another franchise. If you take a look at the browser now, you can see that text has been included inside of our list item now. Alright guys, so we've created our list item here, we've added it into the UL using the append method, and we've also given it some text. The next thing I want to do now is make our list item look like the rest of the list items. So to do that, we're going to need to learn how to modify and manipulate an element's attributes or classes. Luckily for us, JavaScript provides several methods and properties for adding, removing, or changing a HTML element's attributes or classes. So we're going to go underneath here and just put a comment of modifying attributes and classes. And the first method we're going to take a look at is the set attribute method. So we'll grab our list item and we'll say set attribute. And as you probably guessed, because it's pretty self-explanatory, what it does is set an attribute to our specified element, which in this case is our list item. So for this attribute, you need to include two values. The first is the attribute you want to set, which we'll just put an ID. And then the second is the name you want to give that attribute. So we'll just give this attribute, let's give it the ID of main heading. And as you can see in the browser now, because we've given this list item the same ID as our main heading here, which is main heading, you can see it's got the exact same styling. So as you can see, the set attribute method is quite powerful. Now the next method I want to take a look at is how we can actually remove this attribute. So we'll go underneath here and we'll say li.remove attribute. Again, pretty self-explanatory. So let's say we want to remove the ID from our list item there. All we put in here is just ID. Close that off. And you can see now it's reverted back to its default styling and doesn't have that styling that the main heading does. Now there's also a way we can access attributes in JavaScript, so which follows a similar sort of method. So we'll say, let's say we want to get the attribute of our main heading here. What we need to do is first let's just create a variable for it. So const, and we'll say title equals document dot query selector. And then grab the main heading, and then let's just log this in the console. So we'll say title.get attribute that we want is the ID, and as you can see in the console now, it's given us main heading, which is the ID associated with our main heading here. So that's how we can deal with attributes here. Let's take a look at how we can deal with classes. So I'll just get rid of all of this, and we'll grab our list item again, and then we'll use the property of class list. Now this class list property has quite a few methods we can utilize, and the first one we'll take a look at is how we can use the add method, which of course will just add a class to our list item. So we'll say dot add. So let's say list items, and as you can see, when we add that class now, our last list item here has the exact same styling as the other list items, because again we've added the same class as the rest of the list items. Now what we can also do here is remove this. So we'll say remove, and again it will just revert back to its default styling, because of course we've removed that class now. Now another thing we can find out is whether an element has that specific class. So I'm just going to log the list item into the console here, class list, and we'll use the method of contains, and we're going to find out if it contains list items. And as you can see, it's returning us false, because of course we removed that class now up here, so it's giving us false. If we change this method to add instead, you see now it's returning us true, because of course our list item here now does contain this class here. So that's how we can modify attributes and classes in the DOM. Of course, the DOM has many more methods than this, but these are just some of the core methods you'll likely need to use. Now, there is still one method left to use, and that's how we can remove an element. And the method to remove an element, or our list item in this case, is a pretty simple method to remember. We'll just put in here first, remove elements. So all we need is the remove method. So we'll say li.remove. And if you take a look at the console now, you can see that the list item has been removed. And if we just open up all of the elements, and we'll open up the div here and open up our UL, you can see that list item is no longer there. So we've learned quite a bit about the DOM now. We've learned how to access elements in the DOM. We've also learned how to create, add, modify, style, and remove elements in the DOM too. The next thing I want to take a look at is how we can navigate the DOM. So I'm just going to bring you guys back to the slide which we looked at the beginning of this video, where we have a really basic diagram of a DOM tree and all of its nodes. Now, everything in this diagram that you see here is a type of node, so that includes the elements, the attributes, the text content, and even line breaks and comments inside the HTML document are considered nodes, and all of these together make up the DOM tree. Now, the DOM object itself is actually a property of the window object, which is the global top-level object representing the tab in the browser. The window object has access to so much information, such as the toolbar, the height, the width of the window, even things like prompts and alerts. But in this tutorial, we're only interested in the document object, which is what is inside of the inner window and the stuff that we want to manipulate. Now, if you also remember back to the beginning of this tutorial, most of these nodes in this diagram have a parent-child-sibling relationship. The topmost node, i.e. the document node, is the root node of the DOM tree, which we use to access the DOM and manipulate all the content. Now, this document node here has one child node, the HTML element. The HTML element is a parent node to the head and the body elements. Now, the head and body elements are what you would call siblings, since they're at the same level in the DOM tree. Underneath the head element, you see it has a child node, which is the title element, and the text, "This is my website," is a child node of the title element. And these relationships are similar over on the other side here, where the body element is parent to the paragraph and the H1. The paragraph and the H1 are siblings, and the text content inside of each of these elements are child nodes. So the my link and the my header are child nodes to the H1 and the paragraph element. As you can see here, we also have a class attribute, and HTML attributes such as IDs, styles, classes, etc. are also considered as nodes in the DOM hierarchy, but they don't actually participate in the parent-child relationship like other nodes do. They're accessed as properties of the element node that contains them, so they would be a property of the paragraph tag, for example, in this diagram. Now, often there will be times where you want to move through the DOM without specifying each and every element or node beforehand. So learning how to traverse the DOM tree is essential to understanding how to work with JavaScript and HTML. So let's head back into VS Code now and look at the different ways we can traverse the DOM. Alright guys, so it's pretty drilled in now that we're aware that the DOM is full of different types of nodes which have parent-child-sibling relationships. And if we just head into the HTML file here just to see this in action, you can see that the HTML element is the parent of the head and body element, and the body element is the parent to the div, but not the H1 here or the UL, since these are 2 levels down from the body. Now the H1 and the UL are what you would call siblings because they're on the same level. So what we're going to do here is use this UL and traverse upwards in the DOM and find out what the parent of the UL is and also the grandparent. So we'll head back into the app.js file and go underneath parent node traversal, and let's just first create a variable to grab that UL. So we'll say let UL equals document dot query selector, and then grab the UL and then just log this in the console. So we've got our UL there, and you can see it hovers over it. And as we know, nodes in the DOM are referred to as parents, children, or siblings, depend on the relationship to other nodes. Now the parent of any node is a node that is 1 level above it or closer to the document in the DOM hierarchy. So to find out the parent node here, we have 2 options. So the first option is parent node. Duplicate this, and we also have parent element. And as you can see in the console now, we're getting the div with the class of container because this is the parent of the UL here. Now say we wanted to actually traverse upwards again and find out the grandparent of the UL, all we need to do is double down by chaining the properties together. So after parent node, we just write parent node again, and we'll do the same thing with parent element. And as you can see now in the console, we're getting the output of body because 2 levels up from the UL here, first is a container and then the body. So as you can see, what we've done here is managed to traverse up the DOM tree from the UL to figure out what the grandparent is. So it's really useful to know these kind of properties. Now you may be wondering what the difference is between these two, and it will make more sense when we take a look at how we can traverse child nodes in just a moment. But basically the clue is in the name. So you can see here we have parent element and parent node, and we know that elements are a type of node, and this is where it can confuse people, because as we know, nodes can be text, they can be a document, comments, or even line breaks. So this distinction can help grasp the difference between the two. Now that might still confuse you guys a little bit, so I'm just going to show you this in action. So I'm going to comment all these out, and I'm just going to create a variable for our HTML element. So we're going to set this to document element, and then I'll just log this in the console again. So we'll log in here HTML, and you can see we've selected our HTML there. Now I'm going to do the same thing and apply the parent node and the parent element property to this HTML variable. Say parent node, duplicate this, and we'll say parent element. And as you can see, when we take a look at the console now, the parent element is returning us null. That's because the job of the parent element property here is to try and retrieve the parent element of the HTML element, i.e. the document node. However, the document node and an element node aren't the same type of node, hence why we're getting this null here. So the parent node property will try and retrieve any node, regardless that type of node. So generally, parent node is more commonly used when we're traversing the DOM. But again, even if you use parent element, you likely won't run into this problem. So that's how we can navigate upwards in the DOM. Let's now take a look at how we can traverse downwards in the DOM by taking a look at the child node traversals in the DOM tree. So for this example, we're still going to stick with the UL, and we're going to traverse downwards into the list items. So I'm just going to comment this out and then go underneath the comment. And because we're sticking with the UL here, I'm just going to put this here so we can see it. And I'm just going to console log in UL. Now, just like the property of parent node and parent element, we also have child node properties and child element properties, which pretty much work in the exact same way. So let's first take a look at the child nodes property and see what it gives us. So after the UL, I'm just going to type in here child nodes. You can see in the console now it's given us a node list, and if I open this up, we get a list of every child node inside of the UL. Now again, this is where the distinction between nodes and elements becomes more evident, because you might have expected this property here to give us the 5 list items, but in addition to the 5 list items, 6 text nodes. This is because we actually wrote out our own HTML. This wasn't generated by JavaScript, and inside of the HTML here, the indentation between element nodes is counted in the DOM tree as text nodes. So just to show you guys what happens if I remove one of those indentations, so I'm just going to put this list item in the same line as the 4th one. You can see now in the node list it's saying 10 instead of 11, again because indentations are counted as text nodes. So again, that distinction between nodes and element nodes becomes even more evident. So what I'm going to do is actually just put that in another line again, so we get a node list of 11. Now, as well as this child nodes property here, we also have first and last child, and as you probably guessed, this just selects the first and last child node of our list here. So I'm just going to duplicate this a few more times, and for this example we need to write is just first child and last child. And again, this is just returning us text nodes, because if we take a look at the node list here, you can see that the first index is a text node, and then the last index is also a text node. Now, when we're using first child and last child here, which is selecting the first and last node, we need to be very mindful if we try styling an element using this property. So just to show you guys what I mean, if I grab the UL here and I say first child, and we're going to style the first child, we'll say background color, and we'll set it to let's say blue. You can see we're getting an error now because the first child here is actually a text node, it's not an element. Now, to select the node we want to apply this styling to, what we can do instead of using first child here is grab the child nodes property and then take a look at the node list, and I think we wanted to apply the styling to this item, which is indexed at 1. So we grab our square brackets, grab the first index number, and if you take a look at the browser now, you can see that our first list item here has the background color of blue, which we applied here in this styling. Now again, like the parent element here, we also have the same thing for the children elements, which is only going to select the element nodes. So what we'll do is just comment all these out, and we'll use that UL again, and we'll log in, let's log in UL and then grab children. Now instead of a node list, you can see it's returning us a HTML collection, and it says it's 5, which is these 5 list items inside of our UL. Now again, like first child and last child, we can do the exact same thing for the first child elements. So we'll say first child element. So that's how we can traverse downwards into the DOM using child node properties. So lastly, now we're just going to take a sibling node traversal. So again, nodes that are siblings are nodes that are on the same tree level in the DOM. So if we take a look at our HTML again, we know that the H1 and the UL are siblings to each other because they're all on the same level. Now it's also important to note here that siblings don't have to be the same type of node like they are here as element nodes. If I put a text comment between the two of these, so I'm just going to put in here space between. This too would classify as a sibling to the H1 and the UL because they're all on the same level. So let's put that in a visual perspective for you guys. So I'll go back into the app.js file and I'll go underneath this comment here. And I'm just going to grab our UL again and comment these out. And just log this into the console here. So we get our UL again. Now, just like the two previous traversal properties, we have properties for nodes, which covers all the nodes, and we also have properties which just cover element nodes. So let's first take a look at how to select all types of nodes. So after the UL here, we've got the previous sibling, and if I duplicate this, we've also got the next sibling. And you can see in the console now we're getting 2 text nodes, and just to show you why we're getting 2 text nodes, I'm just going to create another variable for our div. We'll just call this div. We'll grab the div, and we want to find out all of the child nodes inside of that div. Oops, spelled div wrong. You can see we'll open this up now, and as you can see when we've used these 2 properties here, we've got the UL. Before the UL is a text node, and after the UL is also a text node. So that's how these 2 properties here are working. Now again, like the other properties we used beforehand with parent element and all of these child element nodes, we have the exact same thing for sibling node traversal. So again, if you just wanted to find out the sibling element nodes, instead of using previous sibling and next sibling, we can use the previous element sibling, and we can also use next element sibling. And I'm just going to comment out this. And if you take a look at the console now, you see we're getting the H1 because this is the previous element sibling node beforehand in the HTML, as you can see here. And then for the next element sibling, we're getting a null because there's no element nodes after the UL. Alright guys, so we've gone through quite a bit of information now regarding the DOM. We've looked at what the DOM is, we've looked at how we can add elements to the DOM, style elements in the DOM, remove and modify elements in the DOM, and we've just learned how we can traverse the DOM. The last topic I want to cover in this tutorial is taking a look at event listeners. Now, event listeners are among the most frequently used JavaScript structures in web design, and what they do is basically just allow us to add interactive functionality to HTML elements by listening to different events that take place on the page, such as when a user presses a key, or when elements load, or when a user clicks a button. Now, the most common events you might listen out for are load events, touch start events, key down events, mouse over events, and of course click events. Now we'll take a look at some of these in just a moment, and I will leave a link in the description if you guys want to check out all the other DOM events. But let's learn about the 2 most common ways we can add event listeners in our projects. Now the first way we can include an event is actually inside of our index.html and directly inside one of these elements. So what this event is the global onEvent attribute, and this way of creating an event to an element works pretty much like any attribute. We insert it directly into the HTML element that's present on the page, or the element we want to apply the event to, and then apply a 1-liner script to that particular element, which in this case is going to be this button here for our first example. So we'll go inside the opening tag here like we do with any other sort of attribute, and then we include whichever event we'd like to happen. For this example, we're going to use an onClick event, so we'll say onClick. And what I want to fire off when we click on this button is just to show us an alert box that has the content of I love JavaScript. So we'll put in here alert, and then we'll put the content of I love JavaScript, and that's all we need to write for this attribute. So the syntax for this, as you can see, is pretty simple. We've included the onClick event attribute, so when we click on this specific button in the browser now, the event will fire off, and then the alert function will be executed, which will have the text of I love JavaScript inside of it. So we'll head into the browser now, and I'm going to click on this button here. And as you can see, when I click on the button, the alert box pops up, and it's got the content of I love JavaScript, which we wrote inside of this attribute here. So that's the first way we could include an event in our projects, which is just direct into the HTML on the element we want to apply the event to. So pretty simple, and probably the most direct method of including an event listener inside of our projects. Now the next method to create an event listener is the JavaScript add event listener method. So to create that, we'll head back inside our app.js file, and the way this method works is first include a element that we want to apply the event listener to. So we'll just put in here element, and then we use the add event listener method, and then inside of here we include the type of event. In this example, we'll use another click event, and then after this, the second parameter is the function we want to fire off. And then we also have an option here for a third parameter, which will take in a Boolean data type, so true or false. And this is in relation to bubbling and capturing, which we will speak about in a moment, but we're not going to include that at the moment because by default it's already false, so it's not too important yet. So we'll just close that off. So that's essentially the syntax of adding an event listener using the add event listener method. So for this example, we're going to use the example 2 button here, and again we're going to create another alert box. So the first thing we want to do is create a variable for us to reference from. So we'll call it button 2, and the button 2 in the HTML here you can see has a class of btn, so we're going to retrieve that. So document dot query selector, and then grab the btn2, and then first we want to create a callback function. So the function, we'll call this alert btn, and inside of here we'll just put another alert box, and then type in here I also love JavaScript. And then what we need to do now is include our event listener. So we're just gonna copy the syntax, paste it in here. The element is that button 2, so we've got our add event listener method there, and then the function is going to be that alert btn, and we've got a little, and it's saying, well, we've got the e in listener. So what we've done now is included a click event on the button 2, which is this button here. So when we click on this alert box should fire off and should appear at the top of the screen with the content again of I also love JavaScript. So let's test this out. And as you can see now, this event is working, and we're getting our alert box which has the content of I also love JavaScript. So that's how we can use the add event listener method here. So let's take a look at another example, for example 3. So instead of a click event, we'll look at a mouse over event. So we'll say mouse over here. So for this example, instead of clicking on a button here, when I move the mouse over, I want the background of this whole box to change. So to do that, let's first grab, I think it's box 3. So we'll create a variable for it, and we'll call this variable new background color. Grab the box, so document.query selector, and it's box 3, and then we'll first create the function. So we'll say function change bg color. So we'll grab that variable now, new background color, style dot background color, and let's set it to the color of blue, and then we'll now include that mouse over event. So we'll grab the variable add event listener method, and we'll say mouse over, and then the function, which is change bg color. So if I head over to example 3, if I now move the mouse over the box here, it should change its background color to blue. And as you can see, that's working as it should. We managed to change the style of our third box using the mouse over event and the event listener method. Now generally people do tend to use the add event listener method more than the HTML on event method, typically because you can apply as many event listeners to an element through the add event listener method, whereas with the HTML on event method you can only apply it once. So if you had one event already on a HTML element and then you try to apply another one, that new one would override the old one. But again, if you only want to apply one event, the on-event method works perfectly fine. So these were some really basic example, guys, of how we can implement event listeners. We'll now take things a little step further by creating a reveal hide event where we click a button to display some text which is originally hidden. Alright guys, so the really cool thing about event listeners is that we can combine them with CSS and other JavaScript tools to create interactive and fun constructs, which for this part of the tutorial is our simple example here where we have a button, and then when I click on this button you can see it reveals more text, and if I click on the button again it hides the text. Now the HTML for this example is really simple. So we've got a div here with a class of container. Inside of that div we've got a button element which has the class of reveal btn and a class of boxes which is just a general class. Underneath that we have a div with a class of hidden content which has all of our dummy text inside of it. This also has a class of boxes, and this is what it currently looks like right now in our live server. Now the first thing I want to do here is go in our app.js file and create two constants. So we grab those two elements. So the first one is going to be for our button. We'll just call this reveal btn, and then we'll say document dot query selector, and we'll grab that element which has a class of reveal btn, and then we want to create another constant for our hidden section. So we'll call this let's call this hidden content, and then document dot query selector, and then grab a class of hidden content, which I think, yeah. So we've got our two constants there. The next thing I want to do now is create a callback function which will check if our hidden content here has the class of reveal btn. Now I will explain this in more depth, but for now let's just create that function. So we're going to create that function. We'll call this function reveal content, and then inside the curly braces here we want to use an if-else statement. So we'll use the if statement first. Inside of the brackets is our condition. So we'll say if our hidden content, grab the class list property, contains class of reveal btn. So there's our condition. The code that we want to execute if this condition is true, grab the hidden content, grab the class list property, and we want to actually remove this class if it does contain the class. So we want to remove the class of reveal btn. Again, this will make more sense in just a moment, but we're just going to write this out for now. Else, if it doesn't contain that class of reveal btn, then we want to grab the hidden content, class list property, then we want to add that class of reveal btn. Now the next thing we want to do now is include our event listener. So we want to apply the event listener on our button here. So we'll say reveal btn, add event listener, and we want to look out for a click event, and then the function we want to run off is the reveal content function we just created. And the last thing we're going to do now is visually hide our div here which has the dummy text. So we'll do that inside our style sheet. So we'll go inside the internal style sheet here, grab the class of hidden content, and we'll say display none. And then when the function runs off and it does include our class of reveal btn, we want to grab the hidden content, grab the reveal btn class, and then we want to display as block. So this now should be working. So if I click on our button, you can see it reveals our paragraph. If I click on the button again, it hides the content. So what we're essentially saying here is that depending on the current state of our hidden content here, JavaScript will either add or remove the reveal btn class. So in its current state right now, this button here does not have the class of reveal btn, and hence why it's not displaying, because we've set this here to none. When we do click on this button, it will display as block because we've added our event listener here, which looks out for a click. It will run through this function. It will check here if it does contain the reveal btn, which it doesn't. So if it doesn't, we've got our else statement here, which will add that class of reveal btn. And because we've set it as block here, it will now display it if we click on the button. And as you can see, it's displaying it now. And if we click on this button again, it will run through our function here, and it will first check if it contains the class of reveal btn, which it does currently in this state. So it will remove that class of btn, and because in our internal style sheet here we've set the display to none, it will effectively hide our content and just show us the button here. So if I just show you guys what that looks like, if I just comment out the remove section, if I click on the button, it will display it because currently right now it's added the class of reveal btn. But if I click on this now, you can see now it's still displaying the text because in our if statement here we no longer have the ability to remove that class. So that's how we can create a really basic reveal HUD functionality using event listeners, which looks pretty simple, but this technique actually can be used for many different things. So for instance, you can use it for things like toggling a menu on small screens, so when you see that hamburger menu, or you can display error messages with this, and many more things you can do. So guys, that's how we can create events in JavaScript, how we can fire off different types of events. And again, there are loads of different types of events we can create, and I'll leave a link in the description for you guys if you guys want to check those out. Now this is actually just scratching at the surface of event listeners. There are some things lurking underneath, or more appropriately put, lurking behind the scenes of event listeners, and that is event propagation and event delegation. Let's first take a look at what event propagation is and what it means. Now event propagation refers to how an event travels through the document object model, or the DOM tree, and you can think of event propagation as electricity running through a wire until it reaches its destination. Now as we're fully aware, the DOM is full of nodes, and when we're referring to event propagation and events, the event needs to pass through every node on the DOM until it reaches the end, or it's forcibly stopped. Now event propagation is also the umbrella term which is used to cover three phases when dealing with event listeners. You first got the event capturing, then you've got the target, and then you've got the event bubbling. Now in the simplest definition, the capturing phase starts from the root and travels all the way to the target. After it's reached the target, it goes into the bubbling phase, which travels back up from the target to the root. So to better understand this, let's take a look at a visual representation of the event propagation. So in this slide you can see we have a basic diagram of our three phases. Now imagine that our button at the bottom here has a click event attached to it and is being clicked. Now when this happens, JavaScript behind the scenes starts the three phases. First it begins with the capture phase, where it starts at the highest level of the DOM and it will trickle all the way down and will notify each element. So it will notify the HTML element, the body and the div, and tell it that something underneath it is being clicked. So again, going back to that analogy of electricity running through a wire. So this will trickle until it reaches the target phase. This phase is the DOM node in which we click. So in our example, the button here at the bottom has a click event attached to it. So this would be the target and essentially our target phase. So once this target phase is triggered, the next phase is what we'd call the bubbling phase, which is essentially just the opposite of the capture phase. This travels back up the DOM and notifies every element, so the div, the body, the HTML, the document, all the way up to the highest level parent of the target. Again, this is all happening behind the scenes and is almost instantaneous. So let's go ahead into VS Code now and take a look at what this looks like in the browser and the console. Alright guys, so we're inside VS Code here, and you can see in our example here we have several elements nested inside of each other. If you take a look at the HTML, the markup is pretty simple for this. So we've got our div which has a class of div2. Inside of that we've got another div with a class of div1, and then inside of that div we have a button element. So this is what it looks like in the browser, and as you can see it just has some basic styling. Now if we head into the JavaScript here, you can see we have event listeners on pretty much everything in the DOM tree. So we've got one for the window, we've got one for the document, we've got one for the div2, div1, and then the button here. Now as you can see, I've set this up a little bit differently in regards to the event listeners. Instead of creating a variable for the window, the document, as well as the elements here, I've just added the event listeners directly after. Now creating a variable and doing it this way both work perfectly fine, but for this example there's less code here and it just saves me scrolling up and down a bunch of times, which can be a pain for people. Now in regards to the events themselves, you can see their click events, and as for the functions, they just simply log in their respective name in the DOM tree, except for the button here. Now instead of the text, you can see we've included an E inside of the function's parameters, as well as the inside the function we're logging in that E. Now I will explain what this is in just a moment, but first I just want to draw your attention to the third parameter inside of all these event listeners. So if I highlight them all for you now, you can see they all have a boolean value of true. Now if you guys remember back to a bit earlier in the video when we were learning about the add event listener method, there was a third optional parameter we could include. Well, this third parameter dictates whether we want to use event capture or event bubbling. So let's go ahead and click on the button here in the browser and see what this gives us in the console. So as you can see now in the console, it's given us the first phase, which is the capture phase. So it's starting from the window and then it's going down and notifying all the other elements it comes across, all the way down to the target, which is saying is this pointer event. Now the stuff that you see here represents all of the information about that event. So this is exactly what that E means inside of our function here, which is inside of our button. So this E represents the event object, and again this is exactly what you see here in the console. All this information is about that event that has occurred on this button. So if I open this up, you can see all the different properties and information about our event here. So we've got all sorts of things we can take a look at and utilize. So we can find out what type it is. We know it's a click event. We can check out where exactly that button is exactly on the screen in a browser, on the X and Y axes. We can also check things like whether the shift key here has been pushed down, saying false because we didn't use the shift key. So all sorts of things that we can use here and utilize. Now the main property I want to bring your attention to, and the relevant one to the three phases, is the target property here. So this here you can see is saying the button. So this property represents the element that the event is actually on. So again, it relates to our target phase. So if I actually go into our console here and I type in here .target, and I'll just refresh this and I click on the button again, you can see now it's starting from the window, going to the document, div2, div1, because we're using the target property to show us what element the event is on, which again is our button. Now again, we can do some other cool things here. So let's just say, for example, when we click on this button, we'll just change the text to say clicked. So after the target, we say .inner text and set this to, let's equal it to say clicked. So what should happen now if I click on the button? It should change the text to clicked. So as you can see now in the console, when we've clicked the button, it's changing the text to clicked, because what we've done is use the event object to grab the target, which is the button, and then from there we use the inner text property and then changed it to clicked. So when this function fires off, the button's text changed to clicked, so as you can see here in the browser. And if you also take a look at the console, you can see we also see phase 1, so the capturing phase. So we start the window, document, div2, div1, and then click, which is the button. So that's the first and second phase. How do we now initiate the third phase, which is the bubbling phase? Well, to do that, all we need to do is just grab all of the true values here for our third parameter and just change them to false. Now these are actually false by default, and if I click on the button now, you can see it's starting from the button and then it's going to div1, div2, document, and then the window. So it's bubbling upwards, hence the term event bubbling. So from the target, it's bubbling up to the highest position in the DOM tree. Now there are ways we can actually stop event propagation. So let's just say we wanted to stop the bubbling to happen at the second div. We can do that with the stop propagation method. So let's go to the second div here, include our event object. Then inside of here, we'll just say e.stop propagation. So what should happen now is when I click on this button, once it reaches the second div, we want the propagation to stop. So we'll no longer be able to see the events on the document and the window. So if I click on this, you can see it's going from click to div1, div2, because we've stopped the propagation in our function here. Now this also applies to event capturing. So if I grab all of the third parameters here and change them to true, so we're in the capture phase, and then I click on this button, you can see the opposite is happening, because we're starting from the window where the capture phase begins, then goes to the document, and then goes to div2, and then stops at div2 because we've stopped the propagation. So that's how we can stop event propagation happening for capturing and bubbling. Another useful ability we can utilize in event bubbling is to have events fire off only once. So for this example, again, we'll use div2, and I'm just going to comment out the stop propagation method there, take out the E, and then change all of these to false, even though they're false by default. We'll just keep it like this for consistency. So again, if we only want div2 to fire off once, for our third parameter here, what we can do is grab the once property and set this to true. Now if I click on this button, you can see it fires it all off as normal, so it starts from the click and bubbles up all the way to the window. If I now click this button again, you can see it's starting from the button or the target, going to div1, but now div2 is no longer firing, and then it goes onto the document and then the window. And then again, if I click this again, you can see the div2 event isn't firing off, because again, what we've done here is define that we only want this event to fire off once. Now another common method you likely run into is the prevent default method. Now what this method does is pretty self-explanatory really. It just prevents any default behavior that might occur on an element or on an event. So this is quite dependent on the type of element involved and the context of an event. So to see an example of the prevent default method, what I'm going to do is go into the index.html, and I'm just going to change the button to an anchor tag, and I'm going to give this a class of button, and I'm just going to put in here click, and then we'll go where the styling is for the button, and we'll make this a class. And then what we'll also do is just put it on a new line, so we'll say display block, because anchor tags are inline by default. So we'll head into the app.js file, and what I'll also do is just make sure our query selector here is targeting that class of button. So our anchor tag now in this event listener here is now the target and the event. And because we've changed the button to an anchor tag, if I click on this now, you can see it's firing off all the events, but they quickly refresh. And the reason it's doing this is because the default behavior of an anchor tag is to try and redirect us to somewhere else. And this is what's causing this quick fire off of all the events and then a refresh. Now we can stop this from happening with the prevent default method. So to do that, we'll go inside our button here, or the class of button, and we'll grab the event object, prevent default. And if I click on the button now, you can see it's showing us the bubbling phase. The content has changed to clicked and it's staying there. And all this has happened now is because we applied the prevent default method onto our anchor tag, so it's no longer trying to direct us to somewhere else. Now we will see a more practical example of all the methods we just learned, so the prevent default, the stop propagation, in part 2 of the tutorial where we look at practical examples and projects. But I just wanted to make you guys aware of these so they don't confuse you in that subsequent video. Now the last thing I want to mention in this tutorial, guys, is event delegation. Now event delegation is one of the most potent event handling patterns inside JavaScript and the DOM. And what it does is allows users to append a single event listener to a parent element that adds it to all of its present and future descendants that match that selector. Now what I'm going to do is actually break this definition down to show you guys exactly what it means. Now the first part here where it says it allows users to append a single event listener to a parent element that adds it to all of its present children. To find out why this is useful, let's actually just go back a few steps and see how we get to event delegation. So if we head back into the index.html file, you can see we've got an unordered list which has a bunch of different sports inside of it. Now this unordered list has an ID of sports, and then each of these list items have their own ID, which is equivalent to the content that you see inside of each of the list items. And this is what it looks like in the console. Now if I click on one of these list items, you can see it's showing us in the console that football is clicked, and it also changes its background to a light grey, again to highlight that it's been clicked. And again, this is going to be the same for each individual list item. Now to achieve this, what we can do is apply event listeners to each individual list item that we have inside our unordered list. So we'll head into the app.js file and we'll grab the first list item. So we'll say document dot query selector, grab the ID of football, add the event listener, and we're going to look out for a click event, grab a function. Inside of the function we'll include the event object, and then inside of this function what we want to do is first just console log in let's say football is clicked, and then the next thing I want to do is change that background color when we click on the actual list item. So to do that, we're going to first need to create a constant. So we're going to say call this target, and this is just going to equal e.target, which is that list item. And then we're going to say if, and the condition we're going to put in here is if target matches. So matches is just a method basically which essentially checks if the target, which in this case is the list item, matches with our CSS selector, which is going to be li. This is going to return true, and then when it returns true, it's going to change our background color. So after the condition, we want to include the code that we want to execute. So we're going to say target dot style dot background color, and we'll set that to light gray. And if we head into this folder's live server here, you can see we have the exact same layout. And what should happen now if I click on the football list item, the background should change to a color of light gray, and it should also show here in the console. So if I click on this, you can see it's saying football is clicked, and then it's changing the background to light gray because we've just created an event listener for it inside the app.js file. Now again, if we wanted to do it for all of these, what I'd need to do is just duplicate this 4 more times. So instead of football here, we have basketball, and then for the third one we have boxing. For the fourth one we have tennis, and then we'll create one more for golf. And now all the styling and the console logs should be working for each of the list items. So we'll start with football, see that's working, basketball's working, boxing's working, tennis, and golf are also working. So we're getting the exact same thing as our draft example here, except the text is a little bit different, but again it's the exact same styling, and you can see it's working perfectly fine. Now this is great and works fine, and there's no real issue with the code here because we're getting the exact same result as our draft example. But as you'll learn throughout your coding journey, there are always questions to ask when you have written out your code to help improve it. So you can ask yourself things like, can we remove some of this code? Can we remove some of the event listeners and still achieve the same result? Can this task be done writing less code instead? Or can we even optimize this code? And the simple answer really is that we can. We can write less code here and achieve exactly the same result using event delegation. So the idea of event delegation is pretty simple. Instead of attaching the event listeners directly to each of the list items here, we can delegate the listening to the parent, which is the UL here, which has the ID of sports, so that when the LI is clicked, the listener of the parent element catches the bubbling event and then performs our task, which changed the color of our background to light gray when we clicked on one of the boxes, and also showcased some text inside of our console here. So what we're going to do to achieve this now is go back into the app.js file and get rid of all this code here. And then we're first going to grab that unordered list element which has the ID of sports. So we'll say document.query selector, and then we'll say we'll grab the ID which is sports, and add the event listener to this. So a similar process. It's going to be a click event. Include our function which has the event object inside its parameters. Inside of our function here, we want to say let's console log that bit of text. So we'll say e.target.get attribute, the method of get attribute, and we want to get the ID, and then we want to say plus we'll put in here is clicked. So what we're saying here is that when the target, which is our list items, has an ID attribute, which all of them do, whichever one that we click on will display that specific sport, plus the extra bit of text here of is clicked. So if I go ahead and click on one of these now, you can see it saying football is clicked. If I click on tennis, you see tennis is clicked, golf, boxing, and basketball. So you can see all of these now are working because we've attached that one event listener to the parent element, which catches the bubbling event and then performs our task, which we've written in here. Now we also want to change the background color when we click on these. So to do that, first going to need to create a variable of the target. So we're going to say target is going to equal e.target, which is those list items. And then we're going to say if the target variable there matches our CSS selector, which is our li, we're going to want to change the background. So say target.style.background color to a light gray. So again, if I click on one of these now, we're getting an error. That's because I spelt matches wrong. So again, if I click on one of these now, you can see the text will appear in the console highlighting which one I clicked, and then we also now have that extra feature of where the background changes to a light grey for all of our list items there. Now again, this brings us back to our first part of our definition, which allows users to append a single event listener to our parent element that adds it to all of its present children. And as you can see, this has clear benefits ranging from code quality as well as code maintenance, because instead of having all those lines of code in the previous example where we attached an event listener to each of the list items, we now have it all inside one event listener here. Now we've also improved our performance because having more events in our code will take up a lot of memory, and using event delegation we're going to save a ton on memory, which again will vastly improve our performance inside of our projects. Now another crucial benefit of event delegation is the second part of our definition here. So the first part was it allows users to append a single event listener to a parent element that adds it to all of its present descendants. Now the second part of this definition was that it also adds it to future descendants that match that selector. So this is actually in regard to dynamic elements. So let's just say we had an add button here at the end of this box where it allowed us to add another sport to our list. So let's actually just manually do this to show you guys exactly what I mean. So first we're just going to create a constant for our UL, which has the ID of sports. So we'll say const, so sports equals document.query selector, and then we'll just grab the ID of sports again, which is that UL. And then what we'll also do is create another list item. So we'll say const new sport equals document dot create element, and we'll create another list item. And then what we'll do is we'll say new sport, so that variable, which is that new list item, we'll give it inner text of let's make the sport rugby, and then we'll also give it the ID of rugby. So we'll say set attribute first an ID attribute, and then we're going to have the ID of rugby. And then what we want to do is append this now to our list. So we'll grab the sports variable, which is the UL, and we'll say append child, and then the child we want to append is of course that new sport. So we'll say new sport. So as you can see now, rugby has been added to our list here. So if I click on this, it's got the exact same styling and the output in the console like the rest of the list items would, because we now have an event listener to the parent, which is the UL, and because of event delegation, we've delegated the event to the parent. And as you can see, this gives us the power to dynamically add new list items, and those new list items will display the same behavior. So again, without the magic of event delegation, we'd have to use the method we previously used, where we'd have to include event listeners to each individual list items, and that includes any new list items that might get added on along the way, which will just clog up memory, affect performance, and just create too much unnecessary code. So that's going to be it for this video, guys. I know it was a long one and there was a lot to take in, so well done if you made it this far. In part 2 of this 2-part tutorial, we're going to be applying everything we learned now to practical examples. So I'll see you guys in the next video.